By midnight on November 15, 1942, the battleship USS Washington was moving through one of the most dangerous patches of water in the Pacific. Somewhere ahead, beyond the black shape of Savo Island, Japanese warships were closing on Guadalcanal. Washington's radar could see contacts that human eyes could not. One of them was large enough to be a cruiser, large enough to be a battleship. But there was a problem. The American battleship South Dakota was also somewhere in the darkness, and Washington had lost a clear picture of her position. Rear Admiral Willis Lee had the firepower to destroy the target on his screen, but until he knew exactly what it was, pulling the trigger could mean firing 16-inch shells into an American ship. Then Japanese searchlights snapped on. Their beams found South Dakota. Japanese guns opened fire, and in that instant the mystery on Washington's radar disappeared. The large target was enemy. What followed would become one of the most dramatic demonstrations of radar-directed naval gunfire in the Pacific War. But the real story is not that radar made the battle easy. It is that by the time radar gave Washington its chance, almost everything else in the American plan had already gone wrong. To understand why two modern American battleships were moving toward a night fight around Savo Island, the story has to begin with an airfield. Henderson Field sat on Guadalcanal, a humid, mountainous island in the Solomon Chain. The Marines had seized the unfinished airfield in August 1942, and from that moment the struggle for Guadalcanal became a contest over who could keep men, ammunition, fuel, aircraft, and ships alive long enough to control the surrounding sea and sky. The runway gave the Americans a weapon that reached far beyond the island. Aircraft based there could attack Japanese ships approaching in daylight. That meant the Japanese could not simply run troop convoys to Guadalcanal whenever they wanted. They increasingly relied on fast warships making high-speed runs at night, when American aircraft were far less effective. The Americans called these missions the Tokyo Express. They were dangerous, but they exploited one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's greatest strengths, night fighting. That strength was not an accident. Before the war, the Japanese Navy had trained intensively for the kind of decisive fleet battle it expected to fight against the United States. Its crews practiced night maneuvers, visual recognition, coordinated destroyer attacks, and the use of long-range torpedoes. Japanese lookouts were exceptionally good. Their destroyers and cruisers carried the Type 93 oxygen-fueled torpedo, later nicknamed the Long Lance by the Americans, a weapon that could run farther and strike harder than many U.S. officers initially believed possible. During the Guadalcanal campaign, those skills repeatedly punished American surface forces. At the Battle of Savo Island in August, Japanese cruisers had achieved surprise and devastated an Allied force in darkness. Later night actions showed that radar alone did not erase Japanese advantages. American commanders were still learning how to convert electronic detection into a coherent tactical picture, how to communicate that picture, and how to fire before confusion destroyed the opportunity. By November, both sides were exhausted, but neither was ready to give up Guadalcanal. Japan needed to reinforce its army on the island and suppress Henderson Field long enough for transports to unload safely. The United States needed to stop that reinforcement. The stakes were larger than one patch of jungle. Guadalcanal threatened the sea routes connecting the United States with Australia and sat astride the wider contest for the South Pacific. If Japan could break the American position, it could recover the initiative. If the Americans held, they would have a base from which to begin pushing northwest through the Solomons. So the Japanese prepared another major effort. Troops would come by transport. Naval guns would help silence Henderson Field. The plan depended on getting heavy ships close enough to bombard the airfield before daylight gave American aircraft another chance to attack. The first attempt produced one of the most chaotic naval battles of the war. Before dawn on November 13, an American force of cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan collided at close range with a Japanese bombardment, force centered on the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. The fighting was confused, violent, and costly. Ships crossed formations. Searchlights cut through smoke. Guns fired at ranges more suitable for cruisers and destroyers than battleships. Both sides suffered badly. The Americans lost ships and senior officers, but the Japanese bombardment was disrupted. Hiei was left crippled and later finished by repeated air attacks. Kirishima survived. For Japan, that meant the mission was not over. Henderson Field was still operating, and troops still needed to land. On the night of November 13 to 14, Japanese cruisers did bombard Henderson Field, but their 8-inch guns did not achieve what battleship bombardment was supposed to do. The field remained usable. During November 14, American aircraft from Henderson and the damaged carrier Enterprise attacked the Japanese transport convoy. Ships burned, others turned back. Yet 4 transports would eventually continue toward Guadalcanal. Japan still had a chance to get men and supplies ashore, but only if American air power could be suppressed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto therefore ordered Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo to try again. Kondo's force included Kirishima, the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, the light cruisers Nagara and Sendai, and a strong destroyer screen. Their immediate task was straightforward in concept: defeat any American ships that interfered, then bombard Henderson Field so the transports could approach. The Japanese were not sailing blindly into a trap. Reconnaissance had spotted the American force sent to oppose them, although the report was inaccurate. Kondo also had good reason to trust Japanese night-fighting doctrine. 2 nights earlier, American cruisers and destroyers had been mauled in a close-range brawl. The waters around Savo Island had already become a graveyard. Japanese crews understood how to use darkness, searchlights, torpedoes, and aggressive maneuver. Kirishima was an older battleship, originally designed before the First World War and later modernized. But she was fast, heavily armed with 8 14-inch guns, and supported by cruisers and destroyers that were extremely dangerous at night. If the Americans entered confined waters in a loose or poorly coordinated formation, radar would not protect them from a torpedo arriving unseen. Vice Admiral William Halsey, commanding in the South Pacific, knew he was taking a major risk. His available cruisers had been battered by the fighting on November 13. The carrier Enterprise was damaged and too valuable to expose casually. That left 2 new battleships that had been serving with the carrier force, Washington and South Dakota. Halsey detached them, added 4 destroyers, and sent the improvised force toward Guadalcanal under Rear Admiral Willis Lee. The destroyers were Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. They had not been operating as a polished, unified destroyer squadron. They were selected in part because they had enough fuel. The battleships themselves had limited experience fighting together. This was not the carefully rehearsed battle line that pre-war doctrine imagined. It was a force assembled because the situation demanded something powerful immediately. Lee, however, was unusually well suited to the problem in front of him. He understood naval gunnery and radar at a time when many officers still treated radar as a useful but imperfect addition to traditional visual fighting. Washington carried surface search radar capable of detecting ships beyond visual range in darkness, and radar also fed the process of controlling her gunfire. That did not mean the ship could simply lock onto a target and fire with modern precision. Operators had to interpret returns. Fire control teams had to build and maintain a solution. Islands, friendly ships, enemy ships, wrecks, and maneuver could complicate the picture. Radar could reveal that something was present without always telling the commander exactly what that something was. Shell splashes could still be difficult to distinguish electronically, making optical observation useful. The advantage came from combining sensors, plotting, gunnery, communication, and disciplined command faster than the enemy could react. That distinction mattered because the battlefield around Savo Island was almost designed to create confusion. Guadalcanal lay to the south. Florida Island and Tulagi were to the east. Savo sat near the entrance to the sound like a dark mass rising out of the water. The area would later be remembered as Iron Bottom Sound because so many ships sank there. Land could mask ships from radar. Different enemy groups could appear from different directions. Burning vessels could illuminate one patch of sea while leaving another completely black. A commander staring at a radar display could know more than a lookout, but still not know enough. And Lee could not afford to fire a 16-inch salvo at an unidentified contact. Each armor-piercing shell weighed roughly a ton. At these ranges, a mistaken target identification could be catastrophic. As darkness fell on November 14, Task Force 64 approached the area. Walk led the column, followed by Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. Washington came next, with South Dakota behind her. The formation placed the destroyers ahead to screen the battleships and attack with torpedoes. The Japanese force, meanwhile, approached in separate groups. Sendai and destroyers scouted. Nagara and more destroyers formed another element. Kondo's bombardment group centered on Otago, Takao, and Kirishima. This dispersion gave the Japanese flexibility, but it also meant the battle would not begin as a clean line of battleships facing another clean line. Contacts would appear, disappear, and overlap. For the Americans, the first challenge was not killing Kirishima. It was figuring out which radar returns mattered most before the Japanese torpedo forces got close enough to make the answer irrelevant. Around midnight, Washington's radar began picking up ships east of Savo. At approximately 12:16, she opened fire with her main battery at a target identified as the light cruiser Sendai at a range of roughly 18,500 yards. In about 3 minutes, Washington fired 42 16-inch rounds at that initial target. South Dakota joined the action. This was already a striking change from earlier night battles. The Americans did not need searchlights to begin shooting. Radar allowed the battleships to engage at a distance where darkness would normally conceal the enemy, but the opening fire did not settle the fight. Sendi's group withdrew, and more contacts emerged around Savo. Instead of a single decisive radar engagement, the Americans were entering a layered melee. The destroyers ahead of the battleships soon found themselves fighting at the ranges Japanese torpedo doctrine favored. American guns opened on Japanese destroyers, including Ayanami, while other Japanese ships maneuvered into position. Then the night began to break apart. Gunfire struck the American screen. Torpedoes followed. Walkie was hit catastrophically and began to sink. Preston was overwhelmed by gunfire and went down. Benham took a torpedo that blew away much of her bow. Gwynn was hit and damaged. In only minutes, the 4 destroyers that were supposed to protect Lee's battleships had been sunk, crippled, or driven out of effective formation. Japanese torpedoes and gunfire had done exactly what American planners feared they could do. For Washington and South Dakota, the wreckage created a new problem. Their route was now cluttered with damaged ships, survivors, smoke, and uncertain contacts. Washington maneuvered to avoid the destruction ahead. South Dakota also changed course to clear damaged destroyers, but the 2 battleships no longer moved as a tightly connected pair. Communications and station keeping became harder. The battle was not progressing according to any neat radar plot. The Americans had electronic detection, but they were losing the physical formation that allowed a commander to turn information into coordinated force. Then South Dakota suffered an internal failure at almost the worst possible moment. The shock of firing helped trigger electrical trouble in her after section. Circuit problems cascaded through parts of the ship. Power was lost to important systems. Some circuits were restored, but the failure complicated her ability to fight and maneuver as part of the formation. This episode is sometimes described as South Dakota simply going completely black. But the technical reality was more complicated. Not every system failed, and power was recovered in some areas. What mattered tactically was that a battleship already trying to navigate a confused night action suddenly lost portions of the electrical network supporting fire control, communications, and other functions. A modern warship can have armor, enormous guns, and sophisticated radar, yet still become vulnerable if the systems connecting those capabilities stop working together. South Dakota's problems deepened as she continued through the battle area. Her SG radar was temporarily out of operation. Contacts were being reported at short ranges. Japanese ships were approaching from around Savo. Then searchlights found her. The effect was immediate. In a battle where darkness had hidden ships, South Dakota became visible. Japanese vessels concentrated fire on the illuminated battleship. Kirishima, Otago, Takao, and other ships joined the attack. Shells smashed into South Dakota's superstructure. Radar equipment, communications, fire control gear, wiring, and exposed positions suffered. Fires broke out. A 14-inch shell from Kirishima struck the American battleship, but failed to penetrate her main belt armor. That was a reminder that South Dakota was still a very hard target to sink. Her hull, buoyancy, and stability remained fundamentally sound. But a battleship does not have to be sinking to be combat ineffective. The official U.S. damage assessment later counted at least 26 projectile hits on South Dakota. 39 men were killed and dozens wounded. Her upper works were battered. Search radar was knocked out, except for one surviving radar associated with a main battery director, according to the damage report. Interior communications and fire control circuits were severed. For several minutes, the Japanese had achieved something close to the ideal night fighting situation they had trained for. An enemy battleship illuminated at close range, separated from effective support, and struggling with damaged combat systems. South Dakota returned fire where she could, but she was no longer the threat she had been at the beginning of the engagement. For Kondo, the developing picture could reasonably look favorable. Reports had indicated American destroyers were being destroyed. South Dakota was under intense fire. The Japanese force still possessed cruisers and destroyers armed with torpedoes. The bombardment mission appeared to have a path forward. If the Americans could be driven off, Kirishima could turn her 14-inch guns toward Henderson Field. The airfield did not need to be captured that night. It only needed to be damaged badly enough to reduce American air attacks while transports unloaded. In that sense, every minute of the naval battle mattered. Dawn was coming. The Japanese mission had a clock on it, but while Japanese searchlights and guns focused on South Dakota, another American battleship remained in the darkness. Washington had not been hit. More important, her radar and fire control system were still functioning. Lee and Captain Glenn Davis now faced a problem created by the very confusion that was hurting the Japanese. Washington's radar had a strong contact. The ship was large, and the geometry suggested a major enemy unit. But South Dakota's exact position was uncertain. Radio attempts to clarify the situation had not produced the confidence Lee needed. This was the limitation hidden inside the phrase radar-directed fire. Radar could tell Washington that a large ship was present. It could track range and bearing, but it could not guarantee identity. If Lee guessed wrong, the most accurate fire control solution in the world would only make friendly fire more deadly. So Washington held her fire long enough to solve the identification problem. Then the Japanese solved it for her. Searchlights illuminated South Dakota, and Japanese ships opened on the American battleship. The gun flashes and beams made the tactical picture suddenly clear. The large radar target Washington had been tracking was not South Dakota. It was Kirishima. The range was around 8,400 yards when Washington opened fire. For 16-inch naval guns, that was brutally close. The shells leaving Washington's main battery were designed to penetrate the armor of battleships at far greater distances. Now they were being aimed at an older Japanese battleship at a range of less than 5 miles. The first seconds mattered. Washington could fire without first turning on searchlights and announcing her position. Her fire control team already had target data. When the order came, 9 16-inch guns could send a salvo toward a ship that was still concentrating on South Dakota. Washington's 5-inch batteries also engaged. The darkness that had favored Japanese night tactics was now working in the American battleship's favor, because the Japanese could see the ship they were already shooting at, while Washington had not yet become the obvious threat. Over roughly 7 minutes of the decisive engagement, Washington fired 75 16-inch rounds and 107 5-inch rounds at Kirishima. The exact number of hits remains disputed. Wartime assessments credited at least 9 16-inch hits and roughly 45-inch hits. Later analysis, including examination of the wreck, has supported the possibility that the number of heavy shell hits was substantially higher, perhaps around 20. What is not disputed is the result. Kirishima was hit repeatedly by shells large enough to tear through armor, machinery spaces, steering systems, and internal compartments. Her upper works were wrecked by secondary fire. Fluting spread. Fires burned. Steering control was lost or severely compromised. The battleship that had come to bombard Henderson Field was suddenly fighting for survival. This was the payoff to the technology Lee had trusted, but it was not technology acting alone. Radar had found and tracked the target. Fire control equipment converted range and bearing into a firing solution. Gunnery crews loaded and fired the weapons. The ship maneuvered to maintain a favorable position. Lee had also exercised restraint when identification was uncertain. That restraint was part of the advantage. A commander who fires faster than his information can turn superior sensors into disaster. Washington's success came because the crew used radar to reduce uncertainty, then waited until the tactical picture was clear enough to exploit it. Kirishima did not simply absorb the attack without responding. Her guns fired, and Japanese cruisers and destroyers continued to maneuver. Atago and Takao launched torpedoes toward Washington. Japanese destroyers would make further torpedo attacks. This was exactly the threat Lee could not ignore. Washington had just demonstrated that a battleship could be found and devastated by gunfire in darkness. But a torpedo did not need to penetrate a battleship's armored belt. A hit below the waterline could cripple even the newest capital ship. Japanese Type 93 torpedoes carried powerful warheads and had already devastated the American destroyer screen. If Washington remained on a predictable course while admiring the damage to Kirishima, she could still lose the battle in a single explosion. The torpedoes missed. Some were evaded through maneuver, others simply failed to intersect Washington's course. The American battleship continued changing position while radar tracked contacts around her. Lee now confronted a strange reversal. Minutes earlier, he had entered the fight with 2 battleships and 4 destroyers. The destroyer screen had been destroyed or disabled. South Dakota was withdrawing with heavy topside damage. Kirishima was crippled, but Japanese cruisers and destroyers remained. Washington was effectively the only fully functioning American heavy ship in the immediate fight. That meant the mission changed. Lee did not need to destroy every Japanese ship in Iron Bottom Sound. He needed to prevent them from completing their mission against Guadalcanal. Washington therefore remained dangerous not only because of her guns, but because her presence forced Kondo to react. A Japanese commander preparing a bombardment could not ignore a radar-equipped battleship somewhere in the darkness after watching Kirishima get smashed in minutes. Kondo's force had to locate Washington, protect its damaged ships, consider torpedo attacks, and reconsider whether there was still time and tactical freedom to bombard Henderson Field. The Japanese tried to regain the initiative. Destroyers maneuvered for attacks. Torpedoes went into the water. Washington tracked groups of ships and at times faced the possibility of being drawn into a trap. Lee maneuvered northwestward, away from Guadalcanal, a course that also helped pull Japanese attention away from South Dakota and the island. He was not chasing a cinematic final kill. He was preserving the one American battleship still fully capable of fighting while making it harder for the Japanese to return to their original objective. That was a strategically more valuable choice than charging after every contact. Kirishima, meanwhile, was in desperate condition. Her damage control crews faced flooding, fires, and steering trouble. Attempts to control the ship through engines and counterfluting could not restore a stable situation. The Japanese tried to save men and assess whether the battleship could be recovered, but the damage was too severe. Kirishima eventually capsized and sank northwest of Savo Island in the early morning hours. More than 1,000 members of her crew were rescued, while hundreds were lost. The exact sequence of her final flooding, the precise number of 16-inch hits, and even the exact recorded sinking time vary among accounts. But none of those uncertainties changed the tactical fact. Washington's radar-directed gunfire had removed the heavy ship Kondo needed for the bombardment. South Dakota survived. Her damage looked spectacular because so many hits had struck the exposed superstructure, but her main armored structure had protected the ship from destruction. She was able to retire and later return for repairs. Washington emerged from the surface action without battle damage from enemy fire. The destroyers paid far more heavily. Walk and Preston were lost during the fight. Benham, with her bow destroyed, remained afloat for hours before damage forced her abandonment, and she was sunk by American gunfire. Gwynn survived the night damaged. The American force had won its objective, but the price showed why no honest account should describe the battle as a simple demonstration of technological superiority. The Japanese also paid in ships, time, and opportunity. Kirishima was gone. The destroyer Ayanami was so badly damaged that she was abandoned and scuttled. Most importantly, the planned battleship bombardment of Henderson Field did not happen. Kondo withdrew. That meant the airfield was still operating when daylight returned. The transport story now reached its own climax. Earlier attacks on November 14 had already sunk or turned back much of the Japanese convoy. 4 transports managed to reach Guadalcanal and beach themselves near Tassafaronga in the early morning. They carried troops and supplies that Japan badly needed. Crews rushed to unload what they could, but without a successful bombardment of Henderson Field, the transports were exposed once daylight arrived. American aircraft, artillery, and other forces attacked them. Men reached shore, but much of the equipment and supplies that were supposed to sustain the reinforcement effort did not. This is why the duel between Washington and Kirishima cannot be understood as an isolated contest between battleships. The real target was Henderson Field. Kirishima was a means to neutralize it. Washington's job was not to win a trophy duel. It was to keep that airfield from being blasted long enough for Japanese transports to unload. Once, Kirishima was crippled and Kondo abandoned the bombardment. The operational chain began to break. Henderson remained active. The transports remained vulnerable. The Japanese army on Guadalcanal received men without enough of the supplies needed to transform the campaign. The result did not end all fighting on Guadalcanal overnight. Japanese destroyers continued making supply runs. Ground combat continued. The sea around the island remained dangerous. But the naval battle of Guadalcanal from November 12 through 15 marked a major turning point. Japan had committed heavily to a reinforcement effort and lost 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, along with other ships and transports. The United States had also suffered severe naval losses. Yet strategically, the Americans had prevented Japan from delivering the decisive reinforcement and bombardment combination it needed. By the end of December, Japanese leaders decided to evacuate Guadalcanal, and organized resistance ended in February 1943. It is tempting to compress the night of November 14 and 15 into one sentence. Washington found Kirishima with radar and sank her. That is true in outline, but it hides why the battle mattered. Radar did not stop the American destroyers from being devastated. South Dakota also carried advanced electronics, yet electrical failures, damaged communications, maneuvering problems, and concentrated Japanese fire reduced her effectiveness. Radar did not make Japanese torpedoes less dangerous. It did not tell Lee automatically whether every contact was friend or enemy. It did not eliminate the need for visual confirmation, disciplined plotting, good gunnery, or correct command decisions. What radar changed was the relationship between darkness and information. For centuries, night naval combat had rewarded the side that could see first with human eyes, preserve formation, identify the enemy, and close to effective range without being detected. Searchlights could reveal a target, but they could also reveal the ship using them. Gun flashes could expose a firing position. Japanese doctrine had become extremely good at exploiting those conditions. At Guadalcanal, Washington demonstrated another possibility. A ship could detect and track an opponent without illuminating itself. It could begin building a firing solution while the enemy still lacked a clear visual picture. And if the radar information was integrated correctly with fire control, the first accurate heavy salvo could arrive before the target fully understood where the attacker was. That advantage was especially powerful for a battleship. A destroyer finding an enemy first gained seconds in which to launch torpedoes or open fire. A battleship finding an enemy first could place armor-piercing shells, weighing thousands of pounds into vital spaces. At 8,400 yards, Washington's 16-inch guns did not need many minutes. Kirishima's armor and internal subdivision had been designed for heavy combat. But there is a limit to what any ship can absorb when repeated 16-inch hits arrive at close range. Radar did not increase the explosive power of Washington's shells. It increased the chance that those shells would be delivered at the right target, from a favorable position, at the right moment. Lee's role was therefore more than that of an admiral who happened to command a radar-equipped ship. He understood that electronic information had tactical value only if the formation trusted it and acted on it correctly. His force was improvised, and its destroyers did not have the benefit of long joint training. That weakness was exposed brutally. But aboard Washington, radar tracking, fire control, command judgment, and gunnery operated together well enough to create a decisive local advantage. The battle offered a glimpse of how naval warfare was changing, not away from firepower, but towards systems that could find, identify, track, and engage before the opponent could do the same. The Japanese side also deserves more than the role of victim in that technological story. Kondo's force had real strengths and made dangerous attacks throughout the night. Japanese destroyers tore apart the American screen. Their torpedoes came close enough to Washington to demand constant respect. Their searchlights and concentrated fire turned South Dakota into a battered ship in minutes. Kirishima's crew continued fighting after being hit. Kondo withdrew not because his ships had suddenly forgotten how to fight, but because the tactical and operational situation had changed. His bombardment battleship was crippled. An American battleship remained active and difficult to locate. Time before dawn was shrinking. The original mission had become far more dangerous and far less likely to succeed. There was also a harsh irony in the way the decisive moment developed. South Dakota's misfortune helped reveal Kirishima. When Japanese ships illuminated and concentrated on South Dakota, they gave Washington the positive identification Lee needed. That does not mean South Dakota served intentionally as bait. She did not. Her crew was fighting through electrical failures and enemy hits, and 39 Americans were killed. But battles often turn on unintended relationships. The ship suffering the worst of the enemy's attention created a moment in which the other American battleship could remain unseen just long enough to fire with devastating effect. The battle also showed the difference between having a technological advantage and possessing technological immunity. If radar alone guaranteed victory, the American destroyers would not have been smashed, South Dakota would not have been damaged, and Lee would not have spent the final phase worrying about torpedoes. The technology worked best when it answered a specific problem: how to locate and range an enemy in darkness before visual methods could do the same. It did not solve every other problem of naval combat. That makes Washington's performance more impressive, not less, because the outcome depended on using one advantage correctly while surviving weaknesses that radar could not remove. By the time Washington and South Dakota met again after the action, the immediate danger had passed. One American battleship was battered but afloat. The other was essentially untouched. 3 of the 4 American destroyers assigned to Lee's force would be lost as a result of the night's action. On the Japanese side, Kirishima lay on the bottom, and Ayanami was gone. The surviving Japanese heavy ships withdrew without bombarding Henderson Field. The transports that reached Guadalcanal were exposed to the airfield they had needed Kirishima to suppress. That morning, the strategic meaning of the night battle became visible in daylight. The Japanese had succeeded in getting some troops ashore, but not in the condition or with the volume of supplies required for a decisive offensive. Guadalcanal remained in American hands. Henderson Field remained a functioning threat. The Imperial Japanese Navy could still contest the waters, but the cost of sustaining the island was becoming impossible. Every destroyer used as a supply ship was a destroyer not performing other missions. Every transport destroyed reduced Japan's ability to move men and equipment. Every lost experienced sailor, pilot, and ship was increasingly difficult to replace. For the United States, the victory did not erase the failures that had preceded it. American night fighting doctrine still had serious problems. Coordination among ships remained uneven. Friendly identification was difficult. Radar displays and plotting procedures were still developing. Some commanders understood the new technology better than others. The naval battle of Guadalcanal became important, partly because it exposed those weaknesses so brutally while also showing what was possible when radar information, fire control equipment, and command decisions were integrated effectively. The comparison between South Dakota and Washington makes that lesson almost impossible to miss. Both were modern American battleships. Both carried powerful guns, heavy armor, and radar. Both entered the same water on the same night, yet their experiences diverged. South Dakota suffered an internal electrical casualty, lost key capabilities, became separated in the confusion, was illuminated, and absorbed concentrated fire. Washington maintained her combat systems, preserved a better picture of enemy movement, withheld fire when identity was uncertain, and then delivered a devastating attack. The difference was not that one ship possessed futuristic technology and the other did not. The difference was that on Washington, at the decisive moment, the entire chain from detection to decision to fire remained intact. And that chain is the real answer to the central question. How did an American battleship find and destroy a Japanese battleship in darkness? Radar was the crucial tool, but radar mattered because it allowed Washington to know more, sooner. That information gave Lee choices. He could track without revealing himself. He could refuse a shot when the target might be friendly. He could open fire immediately once identification became certain. He could continue maneuvering while enemy ships struggled to locate him. The guns provided the destruction, but information created the opportunity. Kirishima's loss also carried a symbolic weight beyond the statistics. Battleships had been built around the idea that armor, guns, and visual fire control would decide surface combat. In the waters off Guadalcanal, one of the war's few true battleship versus battleship clashes showed that the decisive weapon could begin with something that made no flash and no sound visible to the enemy, an electronic return on a radar screen. The old measures of naval power still mattered. Washington needed 16-inch guns to finish the job, but the ability to find first and fire effectively in darkness changed how that power could be used. The transformation was not complete in November 1942. Radar would improve. Combat information centers would become more sophisticated. American ships would develop better methods for combining radar, plotting, fighter direction, anti-aircraft fire, and surface gunnery. Crews would gain experience. The U.S. Navy that fought later campaigns in the Central Pacific would be far more practiced in electronic warfare than the improvised force Lee brought into Iron Bottom. Sound. Guadalcanal was part of the learning process, and that learning was paid for with ships and lives. That is why the night should not be remembered as a clean technological demonstration. It was a near-run battle. A few successful Japanese torpedo hits on Washington could have transformed the outcome. A different electrical casualty aboard the American flagship could have erased the radar advantage. A mistaken identification could have produced friendly fire. If Kondo had retained a viable battleship and reached bombardment position, Henderson Field could have faced another devastating shelling just as transports approached. None of those possibilities were imaginary. They were present in the decisions commanders were making minute by minute. Instead, a sequence of events created one narrow opportunity. Japanese destroyers shattered the American screen. South Dakota's electrical troubles and enemy fire pushed her out of effective action. Japanese searchlights revealed her and focused attention on her. That illumination simultaneously confirmed the identity of Washington's radar target. Lee and Davis had a firing solution. Washington opened at close range. Kirishima was overwhelmed before the Japanese could neutralize the unseen American battleship. Kondo's bombardment plan collapsed. Dawn arrived with Henderson Field still operating. The most dramatic image of the battle is easy to imagine. 16-inch guns firing into the night, their muzzle flashes lighting the sea for an instant. But the more important image came a moment earlier, inside the ship. Operators watched a contact move across a radar display. Plotters converted that contact into position and motion. Fire control crews turned information into gun orders. The enemy was still mostly invisible outside. The decisive advantage existed before the first salvo left the barrels. For the sailors aboard Washington, there was no reason to think of the engagement as a demonstration for future historians. They were inside a battleship, moving through waters filled with torpedoes, burning wrecks, and unidentified ships. Their destroyer screen had been destroyed. Their sister battleship had disappeared into the confusion and gunfire. Japanese vessels still surrounded the area. The radar picture offered information, not safety. Every new contact could mean another attack. Every turn risked shallow water or a torpedo track. The ship survived because the crew kept that information useful under pressure. For the sailors aboard Kirishima, the same minutes looked completely different. They had entered the Sound expecting to support a bombardment mission backed by cruisers and destroyers experienced in night combat. Their force had inflicted devastating damage on the American destroyers and hammered South Dakota. Then heavy shells began arriving from a battleship that had not been the center of their attention. At close range, there was little time to absorb the shock, determine the attacker's location, maneuver, return fire, and repair damage before more salvos arrived. The speed of that collapse was one of radar-directed gunnery's most frightening implications. Kirishima's fate therefore answered one question and created another for every Navy watching the war. If darkness no longer guaranteed concealment, how should surface forces fight at night? The answer would increasingly involve more electronics, better plotting, faster information flow, and commanders trained to trust instruments without becoming blind to their limitations. The side that mastered that process could turn darkness from an obstacle into cover. At Guadalcanal, that future arrived unevenly. It did not save every American ship. It did not prevent confusion. It did not make the Japanese Navy obsolete. But for a few critical minutes off Savo Island, it allowed USS Washington to do something that would have been extraordinarily difficult with visual methods. Alone, track a battleship in darkness, hold fire through uncertainty, identify the enemy at the decisive moment, and deliver accurate heavy gunfire before the opponent could effectively answer. The Japanese had spent years preparing to dominate night surface combat. Their training, optics, torpedoes, and doctrine were real advantages, and on the night of November 14, they proved it by destroying the American screen and battering South Dakota. That is what makes the ending important. Washington did not win because the Japanese suddenly became incompetent. She won her duel because one American ship preserved a more complete chain of information and firepower at the exact moment the battle demanded it. And the consequence reached far beyond Kirishima. Without the battleship bombardment, Henderson Field survived the night. Because Henderson survived, the transports on the coast remained exposed after sunrise. Because the reinforcement effort failed to deliver enough supplies, Japan's position on Guadalcanal continued to deteriorate. Weeks later, the decision was made to evacuate the island. One radar-directed engagement did not win the Guadalcanal campaign by itself, but it helped break the operation Japan needed to reverse it. In the end, the battle was not a story about a magic device defeating an old battleship. It was a story about information arriving a few minutes sooner than the enemy could match it. In daylight, both sides could see a battleship. In darkness, the side that could detect, identify, track, and fire without first revealing itself possessed a new kind of power. South Dakota's battered superstructure showed that the old dangers had not disappeared. Kirishima's wreck showed that the rules were changing anyway. Just before Washington opened fire, the Japanese searchlights were pointed at the American battleship they could see. Washington's guns were pointed at the Japanese battleship they could not yet see clearly with human eyes. That difference lasted only minutes. It was enough.